Welcome to Module 6 of our velocity-based training series brought to you by GymAware. In this module, we're going to go through the application of VBT methods. Now, there are a number of methods that you can use with velocity-based training, and each practitioner will have their preferred way of using it and what works well in their context. For me, there's 4 key areas that I tend to look at and use it for. And I want to break them down now so we can have really good clarity around when to use them and how to use them. First and foremost, rep monitoring. I mentioned in previous modules that understanding what a failure threshold is and that threshold velocity is for each of the lifts, whether that has been tested via 1RM for that athlete or it's a predictive threshold based on the literature, it's really good to understand when that occurs so we know how to drive an athlete, how to get more out of an athlete, but also how to reduce the intensity or volume of an athlete allows us to prescribe 20% above their threshold velocity, which means they're not using a load that's going to deteriorate from fatigue at all for that session. We may want to have an unloading session, and we can utilize this rep monitoring quite powerfully, where it's a basic lift, could be a deadlift, could be a squat, could be a bench press. We're not necessarily eliciting velocity targets. We're simply monitoring the velocity to understand how much more they have left in the tank in each set, and from that we can make really good decisions. It's a very simple monitoring tool, but a really effective way that we can use it in a number of high speed and compound base lifts. Our second one, which is very popular and can be a really powerful option, is using a linear regression model to be able to extrapolate 1RM without actually doing a 1RM. Now, when we look at how that looks, it means that we can utilize our known velocity thresholds, whether that's being tested for the individual with a 1RM, so you see what the failure threshold is, or again, you're using predictive values. And we can actually set a load and a velocity, and we can plot that set after set and see where they come up with. So for example, in this 4 load option, there would be a velocity set with a low load. So high velocity, low load. Might be 30% of their 1RM. Then we can start to attack maybe 60% of their 1RM. Velocity drops, load increases. We go again to maybe 75%, velocity drops, load increases. Finally, maybe we hit 85%, velocity drops, load increases. So now we have a really strong plot that we can then track and regress to be able to figure out what their 1RM is. Now, the 1RM is going to be quite indicative of the day, in the exact same fashion as it would be if you were to test a raw 1RM that day. But what it allows us to do is not take an athlete to a 1RM. We can have a predictive 1RM based on velocity for both testing and assessment. But then we can also utilize this to understand what loads we may select for that training day, because this can also be used as a warm-up. An athlete may come in, they might do a 30% base lift, a 50% base lift, and then a 60% base lift. From that, we can see the speeds that they're moving. We can then extrapolate what their 1RM would be for that day. Then that 1RM can be used to predict any of percentages that they may have been allocated to lift that day. Now, if you're working in a team sport environment where it's very dynamic, things like this can be quite hard to do. If you're working one-on-one in an individual sport environment, say for example, Olympic lifting or things similar, this can be really powerful to make sure that we're going to be very accurate with the loads prescribed for that day, and also use it as a monitoring tool for readiness to train. Because if we see them consistently scoring under what their actual 1RM is, and every day their predictive 1RM is less and less, we can kind of assume that they're not recovering. And we know that we need to then adjust their training schedule to work out what's going to be the best outcome. So this can be a really powerful model to use. Third is our variable prescription. I've alluded to this a number of times in these modules, and this is one of my favorite ways. Using velocity as another variable to prescribe In particular, that middle ground that we talked about, around that 1 meter a second mark, where it's not definitively high speed and not definitively maximum load. It means that we can be quite prescriptive on where we sit in that middle ground, and we can shift that force velocity curve more and more in the favor of the athlete depending on what they need. So when we're looking at variable prescription, we can use it, as we mentioned, the velocity is fixed, therefore we adjust the load to make sure we keep hitting the velocity required, or it's flipped. The load is fixed, and then we're making sure we're just hitting the velocities prescribed, which may be faster and faster, or it may be just the intent to be as fast as possible each day. And that then can tie back into a monitoring tool where we may have a load that we would expect to be moved at a threshold or at least a velocity band. If for whatever reason that individual can't move that load at that velocity early on in the session, it is safe to assume that potentially they are not recovered, they are fatigued, or they're not ready to do the prescribed intensities for that session, and we can modify when needed. And the final thing is to drive competition. Simply having it there with a leaderboard, which is on the app with GymAware, a really effective, up-to-date leaderboard that is live in updating after every single set. It allows our athletes to drive a bit of competition, a bit of intensity, and try and have the outcome we want. So we may have a leaderboard for power, whether that be mean or peak, but that way it takes into account the load being lifted as well as the velocity. We can have it relative, so it takes into account their body mass as well. So suddenly a big group that may not be that homogeneous, i.e. might have short players, tall players, heavy players, light players, we can have a daily leaderboard for power per kilogram, which allows us to then really hone in on driving competition and driving outcome with our athletes, whether that be in a professional setting or a private setting. Now, this is a snapshot of some of the key options that I use and I've found really practical. There's a few other options that people utilize, but for the sake of this tutorial and these modules, these are going to be the 4 key ones that we're going to discuss more on. And when we go into our testing and assessment, we're going to delve in a little bit deeper to a few of these and see how we extrapolate testing and assessment data to be able to influence these type of outcomes.